Okay, so good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to another session of Come Cloud with Us. I am your host, Abdul Kazi, and along with me, Chris Gill. He's my co-host, crime and partner in crime. Uh, today we have a very special session. So one of the reasons I love virtual events is that this event can really become, global in a sense that we can invite people from all over the world, and hence today is truly global. So I'm sitting in Canada, Chris is sitting in US, and then we have Shabaz who's sitting in the UK, right? So yeah, across the pond, different location. And I also want to give out a huge shout out to Shabaz because I don't know if you guys know, but it's midnight there. So this is huge dedication to the community. Really, really honored and humbled, Shabazz, for you to join us at this hour. This is really amazing. So with that being said, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you. No, honestly, it's a privilege and honor to be a guest on this user group. I always like doing, again, like you said, that this whole virtual user group has allowed us to share our sort of sessions and content with a global audience, and I do like doing overseas user groups. It's always fun to speak to people from different countries and see their perspective on tech as well, because it's different no matter what country you go. They've got different experiences. So no, thank you. Really happy to be here. Yeah, so I'll do a proper introduction during my session. But yeah, my name is Shabaz Darr, and I'm based in the UK, and as probably seen in the background, it's very dark outside. It's just gone past midnight here, but I'm wide awake. I had an espresso about half an hour ago, so I'm good.
Nice, nice. So before we jump into your presentation, we try to just do a little bit talk. And one of the things that I want to find out from you, and we generally speaking don't see on this side of the pond, is your title is infrastructure manager. So I wanted to see what does that mean, because you either we see solution architect or like a PC, principal consultant and whatnot. So I wanted to find out what does that mean.
So yeah, infrastructure master. It's a very pretentious job title. It's actually quite slightly changed. They've dropped the infrastructure from it now. So I'm
Mhm.
literally just master, a net company master. And I kind of find it embarrassing when I'm telling people, because it does sound very pretentious, and it's like, it's not. I'm not giving it to myself, but essentially, yeah. So the company I work for, Net Company, they have sort of different areas. They have architects, they have management, and then they have technical, and I'm part of that technical area. So the master is like the top level sort of consultant they have, essentially. So they have consultants, senior consultants, and then we have a master. My job as a master is to lead the sort of infrastructure area, technically. So within the, not just sort of within like my project, but over a broad number of projects. So I'll dip my foot in a couple of different projects, and almost be like the tech responsible, the sort of tech responsible for all those sort of projects. Also bids as well. I'll be technically responsible for bids that are going out. So what tech are we gonna kind of, are we gonna go with Azure? Are we gonna go with AWS? My specific area of focus within my role is Azure Virtual Desktop, obviously, infrastructure as a service, and sort of cloud security. So that's where any bids that come in or any projects that come in, I kind of, again, as a master in that area, I'm kind of technically almost responsible for them, and the way we're going to go with it technically. What services we're going to implement. What in our bid work, how we're going to, from a question perspective, what technologies are we going to focus on. So it's really interesting, if I'm honest, a very interesting role. Very different from what I've been used to as a consultant. As you said, you're kind of doing, I'm implementing, but not with this. It's more of an overall, and guiding our seniors and our consultants. So yeah, a really interesting role, if I'm honest.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely, that's actually very good. So how did you get into IT? Any exciting stories? Everybody has some exciting stories.
So again, it was. So I was at school. I would say I was a medium student. I always had the capability of doing it, but I was always too busy playing football, or I think you guys call it soccer. I was always too busy playing cricket. I was just a sportsman. I focused on sports mainly. So I was a very medium student, and that all kind of went through university. But I did a computing course at university, but again, I never really knew much about the IT industry. It's not until my third year of university I did what they call it a year in industry. So I actually worked for a company with an IT department. I was like service desk, help desk sort of role, so first and second line. So I was doing like hardware fixes. I was doing software support. I just fell in love with the industry. Then just the work that I was doing, I found it so interesting. It was very hands on. I'm a very hands on person, and I learned by doing. So I learned in that 1 year I learned more than I learned any in my degree, my whole degree. And from then on, it just kind of just all fell into place. I got a job in IT 3 months after I graduated. I just worked my way up. I did various support roles: first line, second line, third line. I then somehow fell into a consultancy job, like a medium-sized MSP. I'd never done consultancy in my life, and again, just learnt on the job. I started on networking. I did like my CCNA, and I thought, I love Cisco. And then I fell into cloud. The person who did cloud, the consultant who did cloud, kind of left halfway through a project, and I got asked to take over it. It was a Exchange on premises to Exchange online project. And again, just through, because I'm a hands-on person, just by labbing it and doing it in my own lab and breaking it, I kind of learned how to do it. And then I just ended up doing the project and fell into like this sort of cloud role. And good 8 years later, here I am, I suppose.
Time flies when you're having fun, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's one thing I love
Or
about the
breaking
tech
Exchange
industry.
servers.
Yeah, I don't miss those Exchange. I'm glad I've moved on from those Exchange days, if I'm honest with you.
Last time I worked on Exchange was 2007. Haven't worked on Exchange since then. I don't miss that. So yeah, I'm with you on that one.
At the time, I enjoyed it, but I didn't know any better. Now I know better. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going near that again.
So from an AVD standpoint, we've seen a huge amount of growth, especially from a pandemic standpoint, right? A lot of companies, people wanted to work from, or I guess they were forced to work from home. Where do you see the market going in the next couple of years? You think the growth is still going to be there? The pace is going to be still there now that we are coming back post-pandemic, or you think the pace is still going to be there?
I think what happened. So again, right at the start of the pandemic, like you said, organisations in the UK anyway, were not ready to send people working to home overnight. They were so much used to coming in the office. They didn't have that remote working capability. So people went to AVD naturally because it was there, it was new, and it fit a purpose. And people threw themselves into the cloud because they had no choice. Now, like you said, the world is kind of, I don't want to say COVID's over because for some people
Right.
it's not, and it's still around as we know, but the world is going back to what it used to be. And so is the tech industry. Remote working is now becoming hybrid working, and people starting to go back to the office. My own opinion is that it will slow down because now organizations are going to actually sit back and review, right, what have we actually got, where is it, and what do we need to consolidate now, because they spent so much money in the last 3 years because they had to, they didn't have a choice. Now they have that choice. They'll sit back and do we really need all that in the cloud? Can we have best of both? Can we have hybrid, multi-cloud as well? I see a lot more people going multi-cloud, so not just Microsoft,
Right.
AWS and Microsoft mainly. In the UK, I don't see as much Google apart from educational, education, just because it's cheaper, I suppose. But I see it slowing down a lot because organizations are now going to almost slow down and think financially. Now that we've slowed down, do we really need to be all in, or can we start doing half and half? And I see hybrid and multi-cloud being the next 3 to 4 years.
Awesome. Sounds good. Chris, do you have any questions? If not, we'll let Shabaz get into the presentation.
No, let's kick it off. Let's get them started. So, it's a great intro. Thank you.
My pleasure. So I think I've shared my slide deck.
We can do.
Okay, thank you very much. So hi, welcome to the Come Cloud With Us user group. As mentioned, my name is Shabaz Darr, and for those who don't know, my online persona is I am IT Geek. Some of my socials there on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. I have my own YouTube channel where I create content, so feel free to subscribe there. Is my clicker going to work? Let's see. Yes, it is. So, a little bit about me. That's me at Microsoft Ignite back in 2019. So yeah, my name is Shabaz Darr. I'm a master at Netcompany in the UK, as we mentioned. So Netcompany are a Danish company, but we have offices in the UK. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Enterprise Mobility, and now in my second year, I got re-awarded. Lucky enough to be re-awarded this year. So I've been working in IT for over 15 years in various sort of support roles, as I mentioned, and 8 of those as a consultant working with cloud technologies. And my main sort of areas of focus are Azure Virtual Desktop, which is going to be part of the topic today, as well as Azure Infrastructure as a Service and sort of cloud security, mainly in identity as well. I'm a published author, so I've authored 2 books. One of them is on the Azure Virtual Desktop, which you might be able to see there. So there's an exam prep book, which I did. And also I've done a book on the SC400 information protection book, which I co-authored with a good friend of mine, Victor Edberg. And as I mentioned, I'm also a content creator, and I do various videos on YouTube around exam prep, Azure Virtual Desktop, anything Microsoft Cloud really. So that's I Am IT Geek, so feel free to check that out. So today's session is going to be around achieving business continuity with AVD. So I think a slight change from I think what I originally proposed is I'm going to be talking about how to get business continuity for AVD. So again, if you have an existing AVD environment, how to get or achieve business continuity for that existing environment. So I'm going to be talking about planning business continuity first. I'm then going to be talking about some of the services within Azure that you can use for BCP services, and including what supports AVD. And then we'll talk about some of the DR objectives and metrics that are quite important when you're planning BCP and DR.
Shabaz, you're on mute.
Sorry, I went on mute to clear my throat and I forgot to turn myself off mute. I'll just take it back a few slides. So yeah, the first thing I want to talk about is planning business continuity. So we're going to first talk about the components that you need to protect or that need protection within Azure Virtual Desktop. And the first I want to talk about the Microsoft managed ones. So these are, as a consumer, these are not your responsibility, but they are still components that are protected, but these are protected by Microsoft. The first is the web access. So the web access to your AVD environment. And again, if you think of traditional RDS that used to be hosted on premises, you used to have your RDS role that used to be the web access role. This is essentially that I'm talking about. So that is something that obviously needs protection, but because it's managed by Microsoft, again, AVD, remember, is it's a combination of a PaaS and an IaaS solution. This is the PaaS element because Microsoft are hosting it. Microsoft will have that redundancy, they'll have that high availability for that web access service in the back end that they control. So again, you as a consumer don't need to worry about creating that high availability and redundancy. Next is that connection broker. So the connection broker is what controls connectivity into our AVD environment. So again, this is a backend service that Microsoft manage. So they will have multiple connection brokers that they use in different availability zones as well. And again, with it being Microsoft managed, as a consumer, you don't need to worry about that. The other one is gateways. So again, the gateway is what within AVD and sort of the VDI terms is what controls the user connectivity. Okay, and again, because it's Microsoft managed, same way as Connection Broker and Web Access, this is managed by Microsoft and is hosted by them. So they will have multiple gateways in different sort of different availability sets that, so as a consumer, you don't have to worry about it. Next is we call Extensibility Components. So these are essentially like PowerShell and REST APIs, and we are going to go into more detail about these shortly in the slide deck. And then there's Diagnostics as well. So this is all that troubleshooting and monitoring. So let's just focus on web access for a bit here. So as I mentioned, the web access enables access for users into your environment. And it's normally accessed through a HTML5 compatible browser. So obviously we now have Edge that's kind of utilized, which supports HTML5. And with this web access, with AVD being again hosted by Microsoft, you can connect to it from any device, from any location, as long as you have an internet connection. And for that extra layer of protection, you can integrate Mfa Integration. So when you do connect to that HTML5 compatible browser and you log in with your Microsoft 365 credentials, you can configure it through conditional access to essentially get users to register MFA and do that second form of authentication. Let's talk about Connection Broker. So this is the other service that is protected by Microsoft, and they essentially deal with that DR and high availability. This is what controls the user connections. And it's also that virtual desktop connectivity. So the session host within AVD, this is what the Connection Broker controls the connectivity to not just your virtual desktop, but your virtual apps as well. We'll be talking about application protection later and application security shortly. It also deals with the load balancing as well. So if you've got multiple users, obviously with your multi-session hosts, it deals with essentially assigning users to a session host. So again, a very important service, and which makes it even better that Microsoft deal with it, so we don't have to worry about it. Because again, if you think about the old remote desktop services in terms of that sort of environment, which AVD is really based on, you would have to deal with it. You'd have to have multiple brokers. You'd have to do the high availability. You need a database server for it. It was very, very infrastructure intensive. So with Microsoft managing it, it just takes a massive load off of the consumer. Let's talk about that gateway for a second, and this is again another service Microsoft manage, and again a really important part of AVD, which is why it's better for Microsoft to manage it. But this is that connection to your AVD resources, and again you can connect to it from any device anywhere, and it's that connection of the VM to the gateway and from the gateway back to the VM. So again, another really important service that needs that additional layer of protection, because if that goes down, then you've got no connectivity into your VMs or into your session hosts. So again, the fact that we as a consumer don't have to protect it is a massive, massive bonus. I mentioned extensible components. So this is like PowerShell and your REST APIs. And although, again, these are applications, I suppose, or management tools that you can use from within the Azure portal, what we're on about here as well is the scripts that you use for these. Making sure you have copies in multiple locations, because if you do have PowerShell scripts that you run for automation or REST APIs that you run, having one copy is going to, if that's stored on a file share which vanishes or goes down, that's kind of that PowerShell script is gone. So making sure you have redundant copies of any sort of scripting. But again, with PowerShell and REST APIs, because you can use them from the Azure portal as well, that's kind of controlled by Microsoft as well, so they manage that. The last sort of Microsoft managed service that needs protection I want to talk about is the Diagnostics. So these are all sort of event-based aggregators, and you tend to have two sort of options around this: fail or success. And as the consumer, we can query events that have happened within AVD. But again, from a diagnostics perspective, the sort of tools that are used to do the diagnostics are all managed by Microsoft, they have to deal with the redundancy, the high availability. So if a zone does go down, Microsoft makes sure that we don't lose access to those diagnostic tools. So this is probably more relevant to us as a consumer, because these are the components that we need to protect. And my session here is going to be focusing more on these. I've spoken about the Microsoft managed ones. We're not really going to talk about those again. So let's move on to the consumer managed components. So what we're going to talk about is Azure Active Directory. So this is the identity provider, or one of the identity providers you can use for AVD. Recently, I think the last 3-4 months, it came into full GA. So for AVD, we're going to talk about your Azure network, the VNet, and how we can protect that, and what components we can use to protect that. Active Directory domain services, because domain join is an option. It used to be recently, it used to be the primary and only option, because Azure AD join wasn't available. It is now. It has been for the last 3 months. But we're going to talk about protecting that. And also Azure Virtual Machines, as I mentioned, AVD is a combination of PaaS and IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service. And part of that is your compute, so your Azure Virtual Machines, or in AVD terms, your session hosts. So we need to make sure we can protect that. And we are going to talk about some of the services we use as well to protect it. But let's talk about Azure Active Directory first, from an AVD perspective, and why it's important to protect this. It is the identity provider. So when we're talking about identity, we're talking about our usernames, our passwords, our UPNs. And this is how we access Azure Virtual Desktop. If you think about any sort of cloud resource, the backbone or the foundation of your cloud resource is your identity. Without your identity, you can't access anything. Doesn't matter if it's IaaS, PaaS, or SaaS. If we're talking on premises, it used to be the network. Used to be, without your network, you couldn't really do anything. But now cloud's obviously come in the last 10 years or so. The identity provider is literally the sort of foundation. You can use that role-based access control as well. So making sure that we protect the sort of conditional access policies and the identity provider, using that role-based access control to control who can access AVD and when they can access it. We mentioned conditional access. This is where we can configure MFA and also single sign-on as well. And finally, Azure Active Directory being the identity provider, it allows us to do that on-premises integration. Because you might have resources that you want to share, you want to be accessible from AVD that are on premises. So you can do not just only the network, but having integration with your on-premises identity provider, which is Active Directory, which we're going to talk about. Again, with that Azure Active Directory, it's an identity provider as a service. So a lot of the you only have one Azure AD tenant, but managing the users, managing groups, managing the role-based access control, managing conditional access, that is our role, that is our job as a consumer. Now, the Azure Virtual Network is a very, very important part of AVD as well, because this controls that private and public connectivity. Private, you can connect to over VNets, you can do peering. From a public perspective, you can access to the internet, and you base the sort of network on your organization's policies. Your public connectivity, your private connectivity. Do you allow internet access from your AVD? So it's all based on your own organization's policies. From a network perspective, we can have that on-premise integration by using site-side VPNs or express routes. And again, because you've got sort of network protection, you've got that protection with Azure firewalls or NVAs, that adds another layer, an additional layer of security to your AVD from a network perspective. So these are all things we've got to take into account and think about when we think about DR of the network. If we have to invoke DR, what can we do to protect that connectivity, private and public? That on-premises integration. This is what we need to think about when planning our DR strategy. And again, when we talk about some of the Azure native services we can use for DR, that'll be more relevant then, and it'll kind of be more clearer. So we'll talk about Active Directory domain services. This is traditionally an on-premises service. Obviously, you can host Active Directory servers in Azure through Azure Virtual Machines. But this is obviously dealing with that domain join option. If you do hybrid identity, you have resources and applications on premises that you want to access. And you obviously use Azure AD Sync. So again, really important to think about how do we deal with failover and high availability and redundancy of Azure AD Sync. And again, there are different scenarios that support high availability with Azure AD Sync. And this is that integration with on-prem resources I mentioned. If you have applications or you have data that's hosted on premises or at your data center, you can integrate it with Azure AD to have that hybrid identity, they call it. So from an Azure Virtual Machine perspective, these are the session hosts, really. These are where the users connect to. These are your Windows 10 OS. They do support multiple OSs, so you do support server. Also, Windows 7 is also supported for some weird reason. And obviously now more up to date is Windows 11. And you can customize your configuration, so you can have you can use stuff like SCCM or Intune to customize your Windows 10 environment, have different policies set depending on should the access control panel with the AVD environment. So again, these are things that we need to think about when we are planning our sort of Azure Virtual Machine failover. Those policies, how are we going to deal with that failover? Obviously the Azure Virtual Machines are the amount of compute, and that's quite important because that costs money. So when we're thinking about our DR strategy, we really need to think. Traditionally, when you think of DR, it's normally for a short period of time. You don't fail over to DR permanently, normally. So it tends to be that your DR environment is not fully, from a performance perspective, is not the same as your main environment, your primary environment. So again, from a compute perspective, we really need to think about, are we going to size our virtual machines in our DR scenario, in our DR environment, the same size as our primary? And again, for me, it's probably a no, because again, you're only going to you shouldn't be failing over for a long period of time. You should really be failing back to your primary region as soon as you get the opportunity. So just want to go back to, there's some more sort of components that we as consumers need to protect that I just want to talk about. These are more AVD focused now, rather than the other ones we've spoken about are more sort of Azure IaaS. But now these are specific. So AVD, the workspace, so this is what essentially manages, and this is where it used to be called a tenant back in the original WVD days, but now it's changed to workspace. So this is where you register your host pools and your session hosts. So again, it's important to think about that when we want to, when we think about redundancy. So we're going to talk about master image, your master images as well, because especially if you've got multiple host pools, you'll have different images. FS Logic is a very key component of AVD, and it normally uses an Azure file share. So we'll touch on how to protect that as well, and why we need to protect that. And finally, I mentioned already app deployment and publishing. So there are a few different methods of app publishing, and again, they require storage as well. So we'll touch on why it's important to protect that. So from a workspace perspective, as I mentioned, this is what used to be called the AVD tenant, and you use it to manage and register your session hosts and your published apps as well, your published resources. So again, you can't have your AVD estate won't work without having a work. So you'd at least a minimum of one workspace. Can't function without that, because that's where all your metadata is stored as well in your workspace. From a master VM image perspective, again, we use the Azure image library for this, but your session host can have different images depending. It might be department specific. It might be you might have sort of third party partners who connect to your AVD environment. So having a different image for different session hosts might be required. And what you do is you use the Azure image library, and we use that as well for our sort of DR strategy, because with the Azure image library, you can actually share your image in multiple regions because it can sync to multiple regions. So by default, the Azure image library is highly available and highly redundant. So using that will be really, really helpful for our any DR strategy. As I mentioned, it replicates to multiple zones. So When we're talking about master images, we don't really need to think of any other sort of tool or service to help with the DR side of it, because it's all built into that Azure Image Library, which is really good. As I mentioned, FS Logics is a key component of AVD, because it's that user profile provision. If you think of traditional RDS, again, I'm going to keep. You probably noticed I refer to traditional RDS, remote desktop services, quite a bit, mainly because that's what AVD is built on, and I'm pretty sure in the back end that's what it really is. Hyper-V remote desktop services. But yeah, we used to have roaming profiles. And we used to, before FS Logics, we used to use redirect user profiles and folders. It used to be a nightmare. Such long login times used to be huge and really long, and it used to be a real bugbear for users, and never gave a good experience. FS Logics changes that. It's an amazing tool and service that has pretty much revolutionized user profiles. And like I said, it allows roaming between session hosts, so especially when you've got multi-session environments. You can log into one host. You might log in later on in the day and you're on another host, but your login times are really quick. And it works by doing a file share. So you essentially have FS Logics installed on the session host, and when you're configuring it, you point it to your file share, and that tends to be an Azure file share. So when we are thinking about user profile provision in FS Logics, we need to think about how we're going to facilitate replicating and making the Azure file share highly available, and in a disaster, think about BCP for the storage. So I mentioned app deployment and publishing as well. So there are various ways we can publish apps in AVD. So you can publish it via the image. So if we're publishing apps via the image, again, if we have our image in an image library, that is highly available, and it's synchronized to multiple regions, so we kind of covered there. But so we've got MSIX App Attach, which is probably, I'd say, the latest in app deployment for AVD and VDI in general. And this is where you package the app, and then you store that package on a file share, and then you can essentially when you connect to that app, you're actually connecting to it via the file share. So that file share needs to be accessible from anywhere, or no, from the AVD environment. So that's quite key, again, when you're thinking about DR, because you need to make sure you provision the file share in a region and in a location that is accessible from your session host. So if your session host needs to be in the same zone and the same environment, really. So a very key thing to think about when we think about DR of our app deployment and app publishing. So now I've covered obviously quite a bit around what Microsoft manage from a BCP perspective of AVD and what we as a consumer need to manage. I want to talk about some Azure Bcp services. So these are the services that we're going to use that are native to Azure to essentially configure our BCP and DR of our AVD environment. Okay. So first thing is availability sets. So an availability set is a logical grouping of virtual machines, and this allows Azure to understand how your application is built to provide that redundancy and that high availability. Microsoft recommend that 2 or more VMs are created within an availability set to provide for that high availability. And that meets the, I think it's 99.95% SLA that Azure has. And there's no cost to your availability set itself, but what you do pay for is the VM, each VM instance that you create. Within availability sets, they have what we call update domains. So these indicate groups of virtual machines and underlying physical hardware that can be rebooted at the same time, essentially. So when more than 5 VMs are configured within a single availability set with 5 update domains, the 6th virtual machine is placed into the same update domain as the first virtual machine. And then the 7th has the same update domain as the second virtual machine, and so on, the 8th for the third, and so on. You get the picture. We then have what we call, within availability sets, we have what we call fault domains. So fault domains is the group of virtual machines that share a common power source and a network switch. So by default, virtual machines configured within your availability set are separated across up to 3 fault domains. And while you're placing your VM into an availability set, it does not protect your application from your operating system or application-specific failures. So it does kind of limit the impact of potential physical hardware failures and network outages, or even sort of power interruptions. And your availability set should really be your main option for resiliency in AVD, because like I said, that the free, that it's a free service, but what you're paying for is the amount of VMs you have within your availability sets. So yeah, that's one of the services which is quite commonly used with AVD to add that extra layer of high availability and redundancy. Next is availability zones. So Azure Regions and availability zones are designed to help achieve resiliency and reliability for your business critical workloads, including AVD. So Azure maintains multiple locations and geographic locations, and these discrete sort of areas and locations define disaster recovery and data residency boundaries across one or multiple Azure regions. And maintaining many regions ensures customers are supported across the world and have that high availability. So each Azure region features data centers deployed within a latency defined perimeter. So they're connected through a dedicated, sort of regionally low latency network. So this design ensures that Azure services within any region offer the best possible performance and security. So again, another real benefit to having availability zones as a service as well. So availability zones are physically separated locations within each Azure region, and they are tolerant of local failures. And obviously failures can range from software or hardware, as we all know, or even like natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, and fires. I mean, I laugh because I'm just thinking about the amount of times we've working throughout my IT career, especially in the support days, where we'd have power outages in our server room. The UPS would obviously go on for a certain amount of time. I mean, I remember once we even had a flood as well. So it does happen. I mean, you think these things won't happen, but they do actually happen, especially in countries where you have a lot of rain. They've got loads of rain in the UK. So I've definitely been part of a flooded server room disaster recovery before. To ensure your resiliency, a minimum of 3 separate availability zones are present in all availability zone enabled regions. And also in availability zones, they're connected by high performance networks as well, with round trip latency of less than 2 milliseconds. And they help your data stay synchronized as well and accessible when things do go wrong. So that's quite important as well. We need to make sure when we do fail over, the connectivity is still at the same level as it was. And that's the beauty of hosting, with your public vendors. I mentioned before that traditionally your sort of DR environment is normally, when you was on premises, your DR environment never used to be as powerful or as fast as your primary. I think with hosting it with public vendors like Microsoft, for example, you don't actually need to worry about that because all their zones are just as well sort of spec'd as each other from a hardware and sort of network perspective. Each zone is composed of one or more data centers. So each zone and each sort of location will have multiple buildings. They're all independent of power, cooling, and network infrastructure. So again, just adds more levels of redundancy that we can have using availability zones. One service which I'm a big fan of is Azure Site Recovery. So this should be an important part of your BCDB business continuities and disaster recovery strategy for AVD. Site recovery service helps ensure business continuity by keeping business apps and workloads running during your outages. So site recovery replicates your workloads running on a physical and virtual machines from a primary site to a sort of secondary location. So when an outage does occur at your primary site, you can fail over automatically to your secondary location, access the AVD environment, your published apps, your desktop from that second location. And when the primary location comes back up again, you fail back over. So we spoke about in your DR, you don't want to be in your DR site for too long. You want to go back to your primary site. Also, backup service. I've talked more about backup service, but this is really a way of protecting our data and keeping it safe and making sure we can recover it. But I will be talking about a service for this, an Azure native service shortly. With Azure Site Recovery, we can manage replication for our virtual machines. First of all, we can replicate those between regions and zones. Also, we can use it to, using agents, we can actually replicate on-premises VMs and physical servers. So if we're using an AVD environment, but it is in like a hybrid environment where we do have some servers on premises as well that AVD interacts with, it might be our AVD environment might be okay. It might be our on-premises environment that needs to be, needs to trigger disaster recovery, where we can recover it and have that DR in the cloud. But it's still affecting our AVD infrastructure, so still an important part of AVD that we really need to think of. And with Azure Site Recovery, especially the virtual machines and physical servers, we can use this to protect and have that high availability for those. So I mentioned about backup. Azure Backup is the Azure native service, and this is what we'd use to back up our session hosts and give an extra level of protection for them. But not only that, we'd also use it to back up our managed disks. We mentioned earlier when we looked at Azure Storage, which is our responsibility as a consumer to back up, that we had managed disks as part of your session host, so it's important to back those up and make those recoverable. And through Azure Backup we can do that. And it's not just, we mentioned software and hardware failures, but even like being crypto locked or something like that is a disaster in a way. And if we have those backups, we're protecting against that. So again, using it for managed disks, but also backing up our Azure file shares. I emphasize how important FSLogix was to that user experience, and login times are much quicker for those sort of roaming profiles. It's even more important to make sure we back those up. Again, talk about crypto locked and being crypto locked again, quite a common scenario, unfortunately, in the tech industry over the last few years. It's important to make sure we're backing those up, and we can use Azure Backup to do that. Also, backing up our blob storage, and you might think, well, in AVD, where does it use that? But when we're creating images with some clients, they might actually have an on-premises way of creating images. They might do it through SCCM, or they might already have images that are stored on premises, or and they'll need to upload those into blob storage. So if that's where we have a copy of our sort of the disks for our images, then we need to make sure we're protecting that, which is obviously Azure Blob Storage, because that's where you do the upload to. So protecting Azure Blob Storage as well through Azure Backup for our AVD environment is vitally important as well. So I'm coming towards the end of my presentation. But one last thing I wanted to touch on was DR objectives and metrics. So these are very, very important with any sort of DR and BCP scenario, especially with AVD. So with the DR objectives and metrics, these are various objectives and metrics you need to understand that include as part of your BCP and DR services for AVD. They include something called Recovery Point Objective, or RPO. So this is the least, I always get mixed up between RPO and RTO, but this is the least amount of content that you must provide back to your end client, the end client for service, based on the assets that are backed up and deemed to be recovered. Okay, so this is something that's agreed beforehand, and it's the least possible amount of content you need to recover essentially for the user. So this is the least amount of resources they can use to get up and working. So, in an AVD environment, it's obviously going to be the session hosts and obviously some storage and your network. But it might be a small section of it. It might be just to keep the business running for a few hours. So you might still have loads of users that are able to work, but they don't need to essentially keep the lights on within the business. We then have recovery time objective. So this is essentially a measurement of the amount of downtime or outage an organization can afford to have. So it's the most amount of time you're allowed to have to complete your restoration process, essentially. So say that you do have to invoke DR, but time is money. So a lot of businesses, especially like e-commerce businesses, they can't afford to have too much downtime, because if their websites are down, people can't buy product, then that's costing them a lot of money. So they will have a smaller RTO time than other organizations that don't deal with like purchasing and selling. So it's good to understand that within your DR documentation, and constantly practice your DR. Invoke DR tests to make sure you can meet those RTOs and RPOs. Finally, the retention period. So this is the longest amount of time you retain backups and step before it needs to be replaced. So I think they talk about grandfather, father, son sort of back retention policies, and I think it's I can't remember the phrase now. Is it three locations, 2 types of backups, and there's a saying in the backup industry, I think, that I can't think of right now. But yeah, understanding how long backups you need to keep. Again, each organization is different, but within AVD, it's important to understand how far you're going to back up your VMs, how far and how long you're going to keep your backups of your file shares and stuff like that. So yeah, that's my presentation done. Again, anyone have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me if you don't have them now. But yeah, thank you. Back to you, Abdul and Chris.
Awesome, Shabaz. Thank you so much for this. So we do have one comment, and I know you're just a guy that can probably help answer this. So the comment came from this person. It said, it really seems like this is better for enterprises, not really for mid-sized business. What's your take? What are your thoughts on that comment?
Again, it does come down to cost, but the cloud, and especially Microsoft Cloud, is so with all the sort of automation you can do. You don't need to essentially have this. One thing I didn't mention was Terraform. So using Terraform scripts to essentially have you could use that to provision your AVD environment in minutes. So you don't have to actually provision your virtual machines in a different zone. You can have a Terraform script there ready to invoke and have your environment up within an hour, and that'll still meet your RPO and your RTO as well. So to answer the question, using things like Terraform could be better for medium-sized businesses and smaller businesses that can't afford to have a dormant sort of, because even if you stop, you store your virtual machine and stuff, it does still cost, doesn't it, a little bit. So I think stuff like Terraform, where technically you're not provisioning anything, you just have a script lying there. When it's time to invoke, invoke it and have that AVD infrastructure come up in a different zone that is not being affected by the outages. That's how I would deal with something like, a medium-sized business maybe.
Awesome. Yeah, and hopefully that's helpful. I mean, one of the things that, we'll just slink back here, but one of the things that I was thinking about is, for folks that are maybe managing competitor environments, they've got Citrix environments out there, what have you. Curious, from a perspective of, like, do folks typically say, what, we want to have this as a maybe, a part of our business. So not everybody, but maybe, I have 1,000 users. Maybe I'm only accommodating for 250 of those 1,000 users in a certain DR scenario. What's your feel and experience in the rest of the world as to how folks approach that?
So I think with DRs, it's a disaster recovery, because you're not trying to facilitate everybody. You need to facilitate getting your core services up and running to run your business. That might be only 100 people. Yeah. And the rest of them just have to wait until the primary comes back up. So like you said, that could be just your finance team, just making sure the money's churning. It might be, your sort of websites and, the servers that deal with your websites, getting those people up and running. So yeah, that might only be 100 people, because ideally you want to go back to your primary as quick as possible. So I think it's very rare that organizations will fully invoke DR unless it was like a natural disaster, which you think, right, this is going to be weeks rather than hours. Again, the option's there to invoke it for everybody, but I think if you know what, we've got a network outage with our supplier, and that's going to be, we know it's going to be maybe a few hours. We're just going to get these 100 people up and running. Everyone else can just do paperwork for half a day. I think it's like disaster recovery for like proper natural disasters is where you'd invoke it from potentially everyone. I mean, if you think about it, in a way, when COVID hit, AVD was people's DR because everyone went to AVD because it was essentially the pandemic was like literally a natural disaster, wasn't it? Everyone getting ill and unfortunately getting really ill. So my first project was for the NHS, which is the healthcare in the UK. So that was to get 400 up to 400 people, their admin staff. We had 2 weeks. I had 2 weeks to implement it. I worked like 16, 17-hour days to get, and because you think of what's at stake, you just do it. But that was really intense, and it was the old PowerShell ways as well as WVD as well. Didn't even have the pretty interface to do it on either. But that was essentially them invoking DR because they had no other way of getting people working remotely.
Yeah.
Again, so what I've spoken about today is really how we get BCP for Azure Virtual Desktop. I think originally when I spoke to you guys, I was going to talk about that exact using AVD as a BCP, but I think I kind of changed it unknowingly. But again, that's a possibility to use AVD as a BCP for your environment.
Yeah, no, and also I've seen use cases now because of the pandemic and actually in general. So I work with a lot of enterprise customers, and especially on the regulated industry, they usually send out a physical laptop. So I was working in doing Azure landing zone reviews for one of the larger banks in Canada. They send me a physical device. So with AVD now, yeah, give the AVD environment, boom, you don't have to send out a physical device.
That's really interesting. So we spoke about. I think you asked earlier. Where do I see the industry going now that kind of life is kind of going back to what it used to be? That's one of the things that I see AVD being a massive use case for contractors, because essentially you're contracting for them, aren't you?
Exactly.
And at Netcompany, we're the same. We work for various government organisations, private sectors, public sector, and we get laptops. So I have like 2 laptops that I've used like for different organisations, different logins, everything. But with AVD, you wouldn't need to do that. I could just have access to. I'd still need an identity because AVD doesn't support B2B. I'd still need an identity, but that's all. I won't need a physical device and have to carry it around with me. So I see contractors being a massive use case now for AVD, and they'll move away from having their users connect to it, but they'll move into having contractors and partners, vendors, stuff like that using AVD because it's just much easier than, like I said, physical devices and having to manage that.
Right.
Okay.
All right. I have a fun question, and this was perfect. And you should, maybe this is coming, maybe you don't, but this is a perfect segue. So we're talking about AVD. How many businesses, enterprise are coming to you asking for clarification, or like, I want to use Microsoft DevBox versus AVD? Has there been a lot of discussion in that space?
Not specifically DevBox. I know a lot of developers prefer. So when it comes to AVD in general, the developer use case I see more for personal host pools. So there's different type of host pools, pooled and personal. And with personal, you can just, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio, they're not having to share resources with people. I don't want to upset any devs, but we know how greedy they can be when it comes to resources. They just want as much resources as they can get. To appease them, I'll say they deserve it. But the personal host pool is ideal for them because they have their own virtual machine. They can they can have more compute. And also, I did a talk at the AVD Tech Fest around nested virtualization. I think the dev use case is great for that because, again, if they have a decent sized virtual machine and their session host for personal host pool, they can a Windows 10 Hyper-V have virtual machines on within their virtual environment, so they can do all their dev testing on that as well. So not that specific scenario you spoke about, but the developer scenario is, I think, more suited to a personal host pool than a pooled one, I think.
Good answer. Good
Okay.
answer.
And then I know you were also one of the ambassadors for Nerdio as well. So I wanted to kind of get your take, because initially when AVD came out, it was very PowerShell heavy, right? Not a lot of GUI. And Microsoft pretty much has got caught up. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that even a viable option? I know it can get expensive with Nerdio, but are there any specific feature set that really stand out for Nerdio?
The one thing I like about Nerdio, so there's a lot of the features I've spoken about. They all have their own. They're all so big. You need to be very knowledgeable in all of them. So we talk about Azure Site Recovery, spoke about Azure Backup, spoke about virtual machines networking. You need to have a really good level understanding of all these native services to really master AVD traditionally. Like, so again, when people want to learn AVD and they come to me, so, should I take the exam? And I'm like, have you done Azure Administrator? Have you learned that? Oh, no. Right, well, do that first, because do you do that, then you won't know AVD until you know, because it's just infrastructure as a service with some PaaS, really. With Nerdio, because it's a management tool that sits on top of AVD, you don't need to know all those services. You can be your level 1 and level 2 support and manage AVD and publish it, because it's just so much automation in the back end that their developers have done. I'm a big fan. I'm not saying I don't get anything from saying that I don't work for Nerdio or anything. I'm at Nerdio MVP, but it's different from the Microsoft one. It's not. I think it's more of I hope they don't mind me saying, it's more of a gimmick, really. Just to promote the content, which is great still, and I do love doing the content, but from a management perspective, I just think it makes people, especially organizations, that getting skilled Azure people is very difficult. Yeah. So I think with Nerdio, having your level 1, 2 people doing the management is much more appealing. And again, from a licensing perspective, yeah, it does add extra licensing, but also it's got loads of tools that help you sort of manage your cost. And with the automation scripts you can do in it, I'm pretty sure you can save a lot of cost as well. It's becoming much bigger in the UK now. I know Neil McLaughlin quite well. I know they're doing a lot of work within public sector in the UK. So yeah, it does have its positives, I think, especially having your people not having to master Azure infrastructure. Get there eventually, but especially when it's so vast and big. So yeah, big fan of Nerdio.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I don't have any more questions. I think we're pretty much exhausted all the questions.
I mean, we could probably go all night, but
we also want to be respectful of Shabaz.
Yeah.
It's already midnight, and so yeah.
I've got 8 hours before I start work. I can go for a bit longer.
So here, I'll ask. Maybe it's a cheesy question, but what's the most difficult thing that you find in really deploying this type of infrastructure? What's the one thing that you frequently run into that if there was a magic wand, you would make disappear or help disappear in some way, shape, or form?
Really good. That is such a good question. Wow, we might be here a while now. I'm trying to think off the top of my head.
I mean, this is more one of those, how can we kind of help the community get better with some of this stuff too, to say, is there something that we're running into?
Yeah, so my biggest, if you asked me that 6 months ago, I'd say Azure AD Join was massively missing. And what that's now allowed is that integration with MEM. And for a while, that's one thing I really missed with AVD, that you couldn't have that. It's very lacking on integration with a MDM kind of platform. Because for Windows 10 on premises and Android and iOS, I loved using MEM and all the endpoint analytics. And was it about 3 months ago that it's now Azure AD Join? Massive fan of that. I'm glad they've done that. That would have been my answer about 3 months ago, if I'm honest. Now that's there. I suppose. Oh no, I've got one. single sign-on, Azure AD native single sign-on. I cannot stand ADFS. So as soon as they get rid of that, please, please that'll be a game changer, I believe, as well. And I think a lot of
we did not
organizations-
rehearse this beforehand either. So.
No, I think that's a massive. I think a lot of organizations are waiting for SSO through Azure AD.
Yeah.
It's
No,
on the
I can
roadmap,
concur
I
on that piece, yeah, because especially the cost of ADFS, right? Because you have to get 2 VMs, then the web proxy and all that. So yeah, it's
It's
absolutely
a
massive cost. Just to,
management nightmare.
Yeah.
I'm never a big fan of where you have to separate servers in different networks. So again, I always mention RDS. Traditionally, you have to put your gateway in a DMZ because it's external connectivity. Same with ADFS, you have to put a server outside of your network. Technically, I'm not a fan of those because it's a security nightmare. So yeah, it's single sign-on, definitely.
Well, I think on a flip side too, we're still in that. Honestly, it's Azure AD, and then we have Azure AD DS, which is that kind of running as a virtual machine, and I know that just everyone loves talking about that. So
Yeah, I mean, for me, so I tried Azure AD Domain Services very early on, to instead of having a. I'll be honest with you, it's still lacking in certain features, and so I've in my own tenant in my demo, I've got a virtual machine with domain controller, because I just stuff like group policy and stuff like that. I just like having that extra control, and I don't think the hybrid join is I don't think you can do hybrid join through Azure AD Domain Services either. I don't think.
no, I don't. I think you're right.
So again, it's just. A lot of stuff about it which I didn't like, so I just went back to a domain controller.
All right. I promise that was my last question, but thank you.
Honestly, we could sit here and talk tech all night, honestly.
See, Abdul's looking at me like he knows that I was going to pull the SSO question out somehow, some way, and get somebody to talk about Azure AD SSO. One of my favorites, but awesome. Shabaz, thank you. What a great, fantastic session. Thank you to our viewers who showed up. Really appreciate the questions, the comments, the talk track between us all. Abdul, any parting thoughts?
no, Shabbat, thank you so much again.
My pleasure.
Coming, especially midnight and during the wee hours. This is absolutely, we're honored and humbled, and hopefully you'll come again and
Yeah,
do
I'm
another
happy to
session.
come again.
Awesome,
Love to
that'll
do
be
that.
great. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent. All right. Well, with that, we bid you adieu. Have a great night, great morning, great afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Okay, guys.